Liberal Senator James Paterson joins us. Thanks for having a word to us.
Thanks, Raf.
Why would you want to tear up something that isn't legally binding?
Well, let's go back to first steps. So the Foreign Relations Bill is being considered by the Senate this week, and my expectation is it'll probably pass the Senate tomorrow and soon after become law. What it requires state, territory, local councils and universities to do is, in the first instance, simply register all their agreements with foreign entities with the federal government, because at the moment the federal government doesn't actually have complete visibility of those agreements with foreign entities if they've been struck by those sub-national entities. Then it's the task of the Foreign Minister to determine whether any of those agreements are contrary to the national interest, and if the Foreign Minister believes it is contrary to the national interest, they can veto those agreements.
So you would like the Foreign Minister to tear up Victoria's agreement. You're not saying the Foreign Minister of your government would, but you would like them to.
Yes, as a backbencher, I have been very critical and outspoken about Victoria signing on to the Belt and Road Agreement for a range of reasons. In the first instance, because it is beyond the expertise of a state government to be engaging in complex and contested foreign policy matters. They don't have a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They do not have good advice on those issues. And every other state premier in the country who's been asked about this has said they would not sign on to the BRI and that they consider it to be an issue for the federal government. And in Canberra, there is a very strong bipartisan consensus that Australia should not participate in the Belt and Road Agreement and that state governments should not sign on. So Penny Wong and myself are on a unity ticket on that issue.
Well, she might disagree. However, can I just ask my first question again? What Victoria has signed is not legally binding. So why rip it up?
That's right, Raf. So Victoria's signed 2 agreements so far under the Belt and Road, a Memorandum of Understanding and a Framework Agreement. There was to be a third stage, which has not yet been negotiated, let alone publicly released, as far as we know. And we don't know what the content of that would have been because it hasn't been released. I think it should be ripped up solely for the reason that it's not in our national interest to have a state government entity engaging with a foreign power contrary to the federal government. It is inherently harmful to have the federal government take a position on international affairs and for that to be undermined by a state government.
Well, the state government actually said yesterday, Dan Andrews, the Premier, said he wouldn't tear it up. He doesn't think that would help reset the agreement. But I guess I'd like you to address his other point, and that was this. Dan Andrews said, quote, "It is in our interests to ensure we are sending more products, not less, to our biggest customer."
Well, he might be right, and that's certainly what the free trade agreement with China seeks to do that was struck by the federal government in 2015.
Well, you know, his argument is that this helps the economic relationship.
Well, I'd be interested to understand how that's the case because, as you say, it is not legally binding. It has no impact on tariffs or quotas or any other trade issues. It is a symbolic agreement, and I think in its symbolic form it's harmful, but it's a symbolic agreement, and it certainly hasn't done anything to protect Victorian barley farmers or Victorian cattle farmers or Victorian winemakers.
So that make things even worse if you tore it up. When it's not like things are going great. Like maybe it'd be worse if you tore it up.
Well, as a matter of principle, regardless of whether it had an impact on our international relationships, I think it's entirely defensible that the federal government should be in control of our foreign policy. I mean, it's very clearly set out in our constitution that external affairs is a matter for the federal government. It is not a matter for state governments.
James Paterson is with us. He is one of your senators for Victoria, Liberal Senator for Victoria, 1300 222 774. Our hotel quarantine begins today, James Paterson. I'm just curious. The federal government have been insisting for ages that the ADF could and should have been involved earlier, yet when the Victorian government finally asked the ADF to help with policing work, they weren't available. Why not?
Well, I don't think that's quite right, Raf. As you know, this is a long-running issue, and I've explored this through the COVID-19 Committee of the Senate. Initially, the Victorian government said there was no offer of ADF assistance for hotel quarantine. That has been conclusively demonstrated to be false by the evidence through the COVID-19 Committee and through the Victorian Parliament as well, and simply by the fact that ADF have been involved in hotel quarantine in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. What the state government is now saying is they want the ADF to fulfil a role that's even broader in their hotel quarantine than they have done in any other state.
Isn't it exactly what the Prime Minister was offering, what the Victorian government wanted them to do?
No, it's always been the case, Raf, that the ADF's role would be in partnership with others, whether that's private security in the case of the Victorian government, police as the case in the New South Wales government, or other arrangements that other states have, bespoke arrangements that they've put in place. The ADF is not there to run hotel quarantine for state governments, nor provide all of the security involved in hotel quarantine.
Can I ask a specific question about that?
Yeah, please.
Because the Prime Minister wrote 3 letters to the Premier in July, specifically saying an ADF member paired with a police officer in a team of 2. That's precisely what the Victorian government asked the ADF to do in hotel quarantine. They said no.
Well, what the ADF does in New South Wales hotel quarantine, has been doing for months in New South Wales hotel quarantine, is provide monitoring and compliance, which assists the New South Wales police in providing a secure environment in hotel quarantine. Now, I think the Victorian government wanted ADF personnel walking up and down the hallways of each floor of the hotel, and that really is really getting into the really technical detail that frankly should be a matter worked out between Victoria Police and the ADF.
Can I read to you a part of the Prime Minister's letter? An ADF member, this is from July, an ADF member paired with a police officer in a team of 2 to allow the legal enforcement powers to be exercised by state police supported by ADF members. It will allow a significant expansion of compliance and welfare activity. Isn't that precisely what the Victorian government asked you for? And then the federal government said no.
Well, I haven't seen the letter from the Victorian government making the latest request. I've seen some of the comments from Daniel Andrews in the media. I think it's very clear, Raf, that the ADF assistance for hotel quarantine, including in security-like functions or security-adjacent functions, has been on offer for months and months and months, and the Victorian government, as we now know, declined that offer. But as you've been pointing out in your reporting, Raf, this is one of many issues with hotel quarantine in Victoria. The other is infection control. We know that was not adequate in hotel quarantine in Victoria. The other is contact tracing. If your hotel quarantine fails, you have to have good contact tracing. We know in June and July it was not adequate in Victoria. So, as you've been pointing out, ADF assistance is one piece of a bigger puzzle, and unfortunately in the case of Victoria it failed at just about every level, and that's why we had the breakout that we did. You
don't think it was a bit too partisan to keep banging them on the head about the ADF when they weren't really available to do what the Victorian government wanted them to do?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation, because ADF was available on an equal basis that it was available to every other state and territory and taken up by other states and territories, and the Victorian government declined to take up that offer. Now, as to which corridors they were patrolling and whether they were going to be in the lobby or level 4, I mean, that's really getting into the weeds of it. It's clear that ADF assistance was available, and Victoria, for its own reasons, decided not to take that up.
Do you trust the new system? We've got hotel quarantine beginning today. Do you trust it in Victoria?
I imagine it will be significantly improved, and I imagine that the Victorian government will be living in fear of a repeat of the breakout that we had earlier this year. So if that doesn't fix it, if that doesn't ensure it's the most robust system, I don't know what would.
James Paterson, Liberal Centre for Victoria. James, thanks for your time.
Thank you,